My name is Scott Roberts. I'm the Citizen Action Network Director with the Freedom Foundation. And I needed to tell you that we put these debates on for education and that the Freedom Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have not, we don't, nor will we ever endorse or oppose a candidate or a ballot measure. The IRS takes that very, very seriously, and so do we. So we offer these debates purely as an educational measure to you. As the debate gets kicked off, we're going to hand out some index cards. If you have questions of the candidates, we're going to entertain audience questions. So just write out your question on this card and we'll pick them up just before the end of each debate, and we'll ask as many of those questions as we can. The candidates have the format that we've agreed on. The candidates will introduce themselves. We have questions that we have broadcast to them, and we will pick a selection of those questions that they're already prepared to answer. We will go through some audience questions. We have a few yes-no questions that they are prepared also to answer, and then we will go through closing. We will run the debate right at 1 hour. So this debate will go from about 6:30 to 7:30. We will have a half-hour break, and then we will start from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, the state auditor's debate. I wanted to let you know, too, that the Freedom Foundation is funded by individual donors, primarily just like you from all around the state, thousands of members. And we're able to bring low-cost or free venues like this because of those generous donations. And if you would like to join the Freedom Foundation, you can do that using this form out on the table in front tonight. And we believe that government works best not only when we have high-quality candidates that put themselves out in the way that these candidates have tonight and run for public office, but when the public is also educated and engaged. And that's really the primary mission of the Freedom Foundation, is to engage the citizenry in the political process. And so for that, thank you very much for attending tonight and learning a little bit about what these offices do. I'd like to bring up Trent England. He's the Vice President of Policy with the Freedom Foundation, and he'll bring us a little bit further to the beginning. So,
okay, I have to bring this way down. Okay. Well, I just want to join in Scott's welcome. We at the Freedom Foundation spend a lot of time talking about what people elected to office ought to do, and some of them tell us, it seems like you're always telling us what we shouldn't do, and it's exciting to be able to give the public a chance before the fact, before anybody gets elected to these two offices that we're going to talk about tonight, to learn more about these really important offices, right? Because we as a state are somewhat unique. The second office we're going to hear from is even more unique among the 50 states. We have the strongest, most independent state auditor in the country. But both of these offices, not everyone around the country even has an opportunity to have an election and to make a decision and to think through these issues in this way. So we think it's really important. And thinking about what this is all about, I was thinking last year my kids started taking karate, and I realized a couple months into that process that I had a new option when they started fighting, right? Instead of saying, stop fighting, I could say, go put on your sparring equipment, and you know the rules. Let's make this fair, right? And that's what tonight is about, right? The candidates have their sparring equipment on. The rules are established. They're fair. This is not just an opportunity to learn about the candidates, but to have a conversation that I think will help us all understand a lot better what these offices are all about. And so, again, on behalf of the Freedom Foundation, thanks first to the candidates for being willing to appear and have this conversation, and thanks to all of you who, being willing to engage. It's early in the process, but this is, I think, really an opportune time to have this conversation and think about these really serious offices. Of course, Secretary of State, I don't know, some people may be surprised. We're not going to ask what their typing abilities are, how many words per minute, filing systems, right? This is an office that is really important for two reasons that we're going to I think, hear a lot about tonight. One is elections, And the Freedom Foundation, through our Voter Integrity Project, has been engaged in election policy issues now since 2004. And the other is corporations and working with corporations that are registered in our state. And I know that they're going to talk about both of these issues tonight. We have a great moderator here with us. Blake Knobloch is the co-host. If you listen to Radio Free Washington, now the Radio Free Washington podcast, you know Blake Knobloch. He's also the co-owner. He's an entrepreneur. He's the co-owner down in Lacey of Cigar Daddies, a new cigar store in Lacey that's about to launch. And without anything further, I'm going to turn it over to Blake to moderate tonight's debate.
Well, good evening, and thank you to all of our candidates for being here today. We definitely appreciate it. We know that you're very busy out on the campaign trail. Tonight, I'm going to start. You each get 5 minutes for introductions. From there, I'll have 6 questions that we'll ask. After that, we'll go into some questions from the audience, and then we'll have some yes and no questions for you. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and we'll just start right down the line in the order that you are in. Mr. Anderson, you can start with your 5-minute opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Blake. And thank you, Freedom Foundation, for having this great forum. And thank you, Northwest College, for opening up this room. Rooms like this are always really exciting. There's a lot of the electricity about the ideas that are kind of floating in the air, what's going to happen next in our democracy. And I want to thank you all for coming out and participating in our democratic process. It's really important, and we need a lot more of this. Once again, my name is David J. Anderson, and I am running for the position of the People's Secretary of State. I want to work for everyone. That's why I'm running as a nonpartisan. But when you think about what this office really should be, it's a wonder why they ever really made it a partisan position in the first place. Whoever is going to be the chief elections officer should not have any kind of bias structured into their office. It undermines the duty and the authority of the office. And so I think we should really look at, I will work to make sure that this office becomes nonpartisan if I am so fortunate to be elected. The people deserve that. For the last 10 years, I've been focused on empowering voters. I was the campaign manager for the Top 2 primary initiative, working with the Washington State Grange. And through that process, I really saw the importance of having competition in elections. Competition, all human beings love competition. It is the lifeblood of our democracy. And it's what draws people in, it's what stirs the debate. We need to bring more competition to our elections. Sadly, this next year, there are going to be 26 legislators who are getting a free walk in November. They have no opponents on the ballot against them. We also have 178 judges who are being elected without any opponent at all. That kind of apathy just creates more, disengages people, and it sends people away from the democratic process. We deserve better. And so, as Secretary of State, I'm going to reach out across the state in all communities, red, white, pink, green, purple, hopefully. We're going to try to see as many people with ideas who want to come into the public square. Let's get them involved in our elections, get them talking about the ideas that are vital to our society today. I was also the campaign manager for Referendum 70, which was to protect the state's power in national presidential elections. It was basically protecting the Electoral College. I was gobsmacked that the legislature and the governor were so willing to throw away our state's power when it came to the Electoral College. And so I ran that referendum and made sure that there was at least some modicum of fight against this throwing away of our power. It was also very sad, and I wrote a business plan to protect the 2012 presidential primary. It was also very sad that they canceled the presidential primary this last year. One of the first things I'll do as Secretary of State is I will find a way to get the 2016 presidential primary on the ballot, make sure we have debates in the state of Washington, make sure we are one of the most active and engaged states on the national scene. It's important that we as a state have our voice in national politics. We've been totally robbed of that this year. I've also worked on, this last year, on redistricting. I authored the WE plan, which was a nonpartisan constitutional redistricting plan that paid no favoritism to any political party or a special interest group. It's important that our elections work for voters. and that they not service the interests of political parties. Political parties fundamentally work to control voters. They seek to have power over voters. Just look at the primary election this year, in the caucuses. In 2008, 31% of the state participated in the primary election. This year, 1.6% of the voters participated in our caucuses. The parties had their way this year, and voters were disenfranchised. We need to have a nonpartisan Secretary of State who can fight this battle for the voters of the state of Washington. I look forward to a great spirited debate, and I'm looking forward to having a fun campaign this season. So thank you.
We expect our Secretary of State to run accurate, fair elections where the ballots are counted correctly and people have access to registering and voting. We need a Secretary of State with the actual experience and the unbiased approach and proven leadership to take charge of that office and take it forward. My name is Kim Wyman, and after being a disenfranchised voter, I've dedicated 19 years of my professional career to making sure that everyone has access to registering to vote and participating in elections. I was reelected to my 4th term in 2010 with 66% of the vote in Thurston County. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Thurston County, I'm the only elected Republican. The reason I was elected with 66% of the vote is because I have a long track record of running impartial elections, making sure that everyone has access and has the ability to participate, and those elections are conducted in a transparent manner. Additionally, our office is responsible for county finance, business and vessel licensing, and protecting the county's history. And all of those things we do every single day in a very nonpartisan and open manner, and that's important to me. This is why I've had very broad support across the political spectrum from Democrats, Republicans, and nonpartisan elected officials across the state, and I have the backing of 37 former and current county auditors. Additionally, I have organizations that have supported me, like the Mainstream Republicans of Washington and the Washington Education Association. And I'm proud of that track record, and that's what I'm running on. In my office, we've streamlined the ballot counting process. We've saved taxpayers dollars and led the way for email balloting for our military and overseas voters to increase their access. We've preserved historic documents and made our access to public records better. My time as an overseas voter, when my husband was serving in the U.S. Army in Germany, is really the pivotal moment in the last 20 years of my life, because I was unable to vote in an election because LA County couldn't get me a ballot in time. And until you have that happen to you, I don't think you understand how important it is to be able to exercise your fundamental right to vote. It changed fundamentally the way I look at our election process, and I've had the great fortune to have a job where I can affect that and make sure that every ballot that's in my charge is counted right, and more importantly, that people have the opportunity to vote it. And so that's why in 1996, I had the opportunity to create the email ballot program that allowed better transportation of ballots, gave us anywhere from 14 to 21 extra days of mailing time for those people stationed overseas in the Peace Corps, serving as missionaries and serving in our armed services. The nice thing about this, and the full circle moment I'm going to have, is this November, my daughter is going to be studying abroad in Spain, and she's going to get to use that process to vote, hopefully for me. And it's a nice full circle moment 20 years later. So I want to use my experience, the 21 years that I've had in the auditor's office, managing and leading our office as Secretary of State. I thank the Freedom Foundation for putting together tonight's event. It's really going to be a fun night, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. It's very important that you participate in this election process. Trent brought up a great point. He talked about his children sparring resolving their conflicts. If you think about the United States, what we're able to do in transition of one government to the next and do it peacefully, and when you look around the world and see things not happening like that, you really have to give thanks for the election system that we have and know how important it is. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a senator. I've been a senator for 12 years. I've been a legislator for 16 years. But I actually grew up in the very small town of Puyallup in the 1960s. Had a very good life there in the 1960s, but it was a farming community. And when I was 18, I decided I was out of there. In fact, I tell people the only place I wanted to see Puyallup was in my rearview mirror. So I left to California. I received a degree from the University of California at Berkeley. And at that point, I set out on something I had wanted to do since I was 10. I set out to bicycle around the world. I left with $200 in my pocket, went across the United States, kept traveling from there over to the Middle East. I arrived in Israel the night when 241 military personnel were killed in the suicide bombing in Beirut. I spent 4 months in northern Israel netting fish with fighter aircraft flying over me every day. I worked next to people who fought and died for their sovereignty. From there, I traveled back through Europe. I went through Yugoslavia when it was still in turmoil. In northern Yugoslavia, unfortunately, I was arrested, thrown in jail on suspicion of spying for the United States. And here's the punchline. I remember thinking to myself, boy, Puyallup looks better and better. Fact of the matter is, I came back and I bought the very same home that I grew up in. I live in the same neighborhood. My kids go to the same schools. So what I did is I went into the private sector, had a very successful career in the private sector, working in management and computers, and then sales in the sports industry. But in 1996, I decided to get into the legislature and run for office. Now, I've had a lot of successes along the way. The very close election in 2004 between Gregoire and Rossi, I chaired the Elections Committee in 2005 and 2006 and passed monumental reforms in election law. It was very comprehensive. Everything from the way you count a ballot to moving the primary forward so military overseas personnel could participate in the elections. If you want to go online, the League of Women Voters has a great template where they go over all of the reforms we passed, and it was very, very comprehensive. Secretary of State's office can be much more than just elections. I want to make that point clear. Right now, people's faith in government is at an all-time low. 71% of the people in Washington State do not think that our state agencies fulfill the mission they're intended to fulfill. Up 10 points in just 2 years. The Secretary of State's office can re-give faith to the public that our government actually works. And let me tell you how I will do that. Somehow this culture has got to change. First, the Secretary of State's office can be a facilitator for centrist and moderate legislators of all different types. Those of you who know me know I'm a fiercely independent legislator. When I first came to the legislature, in the Senate especially, senators would fight like cats and dogs on the Senate floor, but then they were very cordial and collegial to each other afterwards. That does not occur today. Actual quote from a legislator: "If I'm seen standing next to a Republican, leadership will have my head." Now, I've always sat on the Republican side. I'm a Democrat. But that has allowed me to forge relationships, personal relationships with them. I know their families, I know their children, and I gain trust. Secretary of State's office can be a convener of people from all sides to make sure we start dealing with the best policy, not the best party. Second of all, we need a state agency that runs right. Howard Behar, the former president of Starbucks, said to me, the only thing you need to make government start running right is to get one example of how it works right. The Secretary of State's office can be an icon for good management. Lean, Six Sigma will not be foreign concepts, by the way, in my Secretary of State's office. We'll have strategic planning that's clear, and balanced scorecards, like they do over here in Bellevue, will be for every single one of my divisions when you enter into the Secretary of State's office. And let me just finally say this. The third thing that we can do new in the Secretary of State's office, I think in the mold of Ralph Monroe, we need a leader across our state in trade and economic development. 95% of our potential customers do not reside in the United States, and the world is exploding with trade and the economy. A Secretary of State can play a very key role in that. I look forward to your questions this evening as we delve into the details more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you. We've now come to the portion of our evening where we'll go through. I have 6 questions that I ask before we get to our audience questions. You'll have 90 seconds to answer each question. When you see the yellow card come up in front of you, know that you have 30 seconds left. When you see the red card, your time is done and you must stop talking, or Trent will come up and put his karate belt on. David, we're going to start our first question with you. After each candidate has answered, the candidate to answer the question first will have a 30-second rebuttal. Secretary of State Sam Reed has said that it is impossible under current law to identify non-citizens in the voting list. If elected, would you take any actions to ensure only citizens are listed as active voters? If so, what actions would you take?
Yes, I would take some action, not aggressive action. I think that Washington State, we are proud of how compassionate we are towards these communities who are working here and who work very hard. But I firmly believe in rule of law, and the rules of law are never absolutely always followed, but it has to always be a goal for administrators to be pursuing that. There's no way that we could ever be like Arizona and be a draconian clearing out of our state of all people who are undocumented citizens here. But it has to be a constant vigilance that we need to have within our voting rolls and within the voter registration in the state of Washington. So I would I would open the office to use more different types of interaction with voters to make sure that their registration is accurate. Possibly using robocalls, possibly using postcards. I think that voter registration, it needs much more of an open dialogue, and people need to not think it's just only you register once and it's over. I think there can be a dialogue between the office and voters. Thank you.
One of the challenges in voter registration is there's no list of U.S. citizens to compare a voter registration list to. It doesn't exist. And so we've done a good job in Washington State, primarily since the 2004 governor's race, to make our list more accurate. And so one of the things we do when you register to vote is you have to show either your driver's license, your state ID card, or the last 4 digits of your social security number. And we actually compare that data to the Department of Licensing list and to the Social Security Administration's list. And so we have a much higher confidence level that these are actual people. They're not dogs or cats. You'll probably remember there was a woman who had her dog registered back in 2004. I threw things at my television at that point, but I digress. And what we need to do is continue that. The challenge, like I said, is there isn't a list. And the idea of re-registering or re-verifying 3.6 million registered voters would be very difficult, and it's certainly not something we could do between now and November, nor would I advocate for it. However, if we want to start in that direction, the first thing that has to happen is at the Department of Licensing, and that's really the natural place. We're one of 2 states that doesn't ask for either proof of citizenship or legal presence. And if the legislature will take those steps, then we begin to move down a path where we have some data where we can actually make the voter registration list more credible.
Kim's absolutely right. In 2006, we went to a unified database in Washington State. Prior to that, again, prior to the 2004 election and the 2004 election, each 39 counties had their separate database. We had to unify those together. We can make additional benefit too. The Pew Charitable Trust has put together a program where we're going to forge regional partnerships between states to share databases and to cross-reference at that point too. Again, bringing greater clarity, greater accuracy. But let me deal with a couple issues. First of all, it's a felony. If you register or if you vote and you're not in fact an eligible voter, it's a felony. And that has to be made very clear. Second, President Bush in 2002, the Department of Justice had an investigation and could find virtually no one who was out there who was illegal, who was registering to vote. 2004, we found the same thing. Why? People who are here illegally do not want to get their name on a public list where they have people like us knocking on their door and make it very available for other people, law enforcement, to have access to, et cetera. I think it's very important that we have the greatest extent of connectivity. I have talked to auditors who have said that we have to improve the connectivity so that you can very quickly verify whether a person is eligible or not. I think we're probably a year, year and a half away on that. But I will make sure that all 39 counties have access to whatever relevant database, and if one comes available where we can cross-reference for citizenship, we're going to use it. Thank you.
And David, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal if you'd like.
I don't have a rebuttal. When I proposed a business plan to have a presidential primary poll in 2012 this year, I wrote a plan to figure out how to re-register or recertify voters. And I estimated that we could recertify voters, the 3.7 million voters, online with a postcard. It would have cost the state $1.2 million. The state said to have the presidential primary would have cost $10 million, and I figured that we could have saved quite a bit of money doing that. So, admittedly, I'm not an auditor, and I haven't been on the Senate. I've been the chair of the Senate Elections Committee, but I think that there are savings and there is ways to re-register people.
Great. Kim, we're going to start this next question with you. Over the past 30 years, Washington State gradually moved from a poll and absentee ballot system to an all-mail voting system. Most other states have not followed, but have maintained poll voting. What is your assessment of our experiment in voting entirely by mail?
Well, we've been doing it for nearly 30 years, so I have trouble calling it an experiment at this point. What we found, our state started doing this really in 1980 when our seniors and disabled voters could register to vote as permanent absentee voters. This in the 90s really escalated when that was opened up to all voters. And what we found over the course of the 93 to about 2003 is that most voters chose to vote by mail. And they liked it, they liked the convenience, and they used it. So our state really was predominantly vote by mail by about 2004. In that election, in the general, 65% of the votes that were cast by mail. So in 2005, and I can remember sitting in a meeting with Senator Castema and his counterpart in the House, and we were trying to figure out how to improve elections after the 2004 election, and one person in the room threw out the kind of flippant response because the legislators were getting irritated with the auditors. Well, finally one of them said, what can we do to improve elections? And somebody flippantly remarked, well, move to vote by mail. And it was funny because all around the room we all went, you know, that's true. It has made our elections more efficient and effective. It has given us much more control over the administration of it, and I think it has improved elections in our state.
Thank you. I actually was involved in writing this particular piece of legislation, and let me tell you exactly how I wrote it. I wrote it so that it was up to the local counties to make that decision. It would be a vote of the local elected officials. And in fact, most counties went that direction, and recently there was only one holdout, and that was Pierce County. Now, I voted against mandating that Pierce County do that because I believe it was up to the local jurisdiction to make that decision. Having said that, at this point, you cannot reverse it just because of the cost associated with getting new equipment, having a separate election system. But let's ask this question fundamentally: has it made a difference? A study in King County, 2011, a report showed that it really has made no difference in voter turnout. Kim is absolutely right. It has made a difference in the accuracy. It has made a difference in the streamlining. But when it comes to voter turnout, it has not moved the dial. And I think that's very important in Washington State that we pay attention to that. You need to know where Washington State ranks when it comes to the number of people who potentially can actually register, and those that actually vote. The data that I shows that we're about 22nd in the country. Whatever data you use, we've got to choose accurate data, and we've got to be one of the best in the country when it comes to both of those performance measures. Thank you.
When I think about paper ballots, I think about a couple of things. Two things I am just absolutely committed to: paper ballots and paper initiatives. It basically goes to what is fundamentally the nature of democracy, that democracy is grounded in literacy. And that connection of words and reading words and having time to read words is what happens when you vote on a paper ballot. When you're running an errand and going off to vote and you're jumping in a closet and throwing some switches, you're waiting in line, you're rushed. There's not the time and the mindfulness that goes into voting. I like to look at voting as more of a ritual that a lot of people go through, that families sit down together and talk about ideas. I think that the mindfulness that comes with voting on paper ballots is much better. And I think that we are blessed as a state to have this process. I think it's much more sound. I think we have better results, and we're more mindful of how we approach our elections. So I absolutely support paper ballots.
Excellent. Kim, is there anything that you'd like to add? You do have 30 seconds.
I think the only thing I would add is what we're seeing nationally, especially in the West Coast states, is you're going to see more states move to vote by mail. I was just in Atlanta in a conference, and it's becoming so prohibitively expensive to run poll site elections. It's difficult to find polling places, and it's difficult to find poll workers, and states are going to be moving and following our lead. I know that there are many people, especially in Pierce County, that would like to see us move back to the polls, but I don't think it's going to happen.
And Jim, we'll start this next question with you. Most election policy disputes come down to the need to balance two competing interests, voter access and ballot security. How would you rate the balance between those interests in Washington's current system? And what would you do to change that balance, if anything?
Well, I think currently it's fair, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the reforms we put down in 2006 and 2005, and 2006. I did mention to you, I'm still somewhat disturbed that other states have 5 to 10 point higher when it comes to voter participation and registration rates, by the way, that are top of 91%, and we're not at that point yet. I think that we need more efforts to reach out in Washington state. I've been in favor of same-day voter registration, which I think is about 1 to 2 years away from that connectivity issue that I talked about. In other states, they have shown about a 5 to 7% increase. I also, and this is a difference between my opponents and myself, I also favor pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And I want to make that clear, pre-registration, but not actually registering to vote at that time. We need protocols, and I hope we can answer that question further down the line. I do think, however, fraud is always a threat. I think you have to look towards security improvements. The League of Women Voters put forward, I think, some excellent recommendations, one of which I'll implement as Secretary of State. I will pay a third party to come in and test all of the equipment we have and test the system to see where there are vulnerabilities. Currently, that's not done. Folks, if someone wants to compromise our election system, they're not going to do it one voter at a time. They're going to look systemically where the weak points are in your elections. I'm going to make sure that we think of that in advance so we're not caught off guard, and especially when it comes to adopting new technology, which I hope I'm able to share with you what I've done in that regards. Thank you.
And David?
I have problems with this question, that there is this balance between voter access and ballot security. I think that both are extremely important, obviously, and we need to always be vigilant to maintain that there is secure ballots and that voters are having adequate access to their enfranchisement. So, it's like choosing one of your children. Which one do you want to give away? It's kind of a tough balance to really even address. But I support the idea of allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. When the 18-year-olds got the right to vote in the nation, it was because because of the draft. We were sending 18-year-olds off to be drafted, and right now we have 16-year-olds who are being prosecuted for adult crimes. And I think the argument is a safe argument that they should have the right to vote and have a say in those crimes. But more importantly, what are you doing when you're 18? The life is hitting you you're being hit hard with life. If we have 16-year-olds starting to vote now, they're still in their family. They can still participate in the elections. And voting is not only a right and a privilege, it's also a practice. And for the same reasons we're encouraging people into early learning in our society, we should encourage young people to vote. Let's be the state that celebrates our youth and welcomes them into our elections. So.
Well, I believe that Washington State has a very good balance between access and security. And what we want to do is make sure that every eligible citizen has the opportunity to cast their ballot, to have it counted accurately, and to make sure that it's not canceled out by an ineligible voter. And a system that clearly establishes who is registered and who is eligible to vote is really the backbone of our elections, and that rests, of course, with the voter registration system. It is the fundamental element of every election that we conduct, and I had the grand opportunity to work with the Pew Center on the States on the project to modernize our voting system in this country, and it's what Senator Castema talked about in making us able to compare our data with other states to make sure that people aren't registered in 2 states, just like we're currently doing between counties in Washington state. The changes I would make to the system, the first one would be we need to print a statewide local vote or statewide pamphlet for the primary election. Many of our judicial races are decided in the primary, and people need access to that paper copy because not everyone has access to it online. And then, as I mentioned, we need to compare our state's database to those of other states to make sure we don't have people voting in multiple states.
And Jim, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you. Let me tell you how I dealt with voter security in after the 2004 election. In Snohomish County and in Yakima County, they had electronic voting machines where people would go ahead and they would press into the machine and out would come the particular votes for that election. No way to audit it. I was one of the first legislators, we were one of the first legislatures to pass a verified paper trail for every single electronic voting machine. That's how I will approach this. If we have a new way of voting using new technology, I will make sure we can verify it and we can audit it. And I've proven that by passing legislation that does that. Thank you.
Great. David, this next question, we'll start with you. Why does your background and experience qualify you to be the state's chief election officer?
For the last 10 years, I've been empowering voters, and I've been fighting for the rights of voters to have the maximum amount of power as they can wage at the ballot box. I believe in voter empowerment. I've seen how political parties have disenfranchised voters, and I want to be the voice that's going to protect voters. The political parties have been suing the state of Washington for over 12 years. Millions of dollars have gone out the door to the courts, to lawyers, and to protect voters. And the people passed the system, but it's being undone by national political parties. So I'm going to be the person who defend that if I'm honored to have this position, and I will fight the fight for the people. Thank you.
I want to use my 21 years experience conducting 84 elections and voter registration and combine that with my state and national leadership on election issues. Those are the things that have prepared me to be the next Secretary of State. I've been selected because of the work that my staff does and the leadership that they show. I've been selected to work on national work groups such as the Pew Center on the States, the Federal Election Commission, and the Election Assistance Commission in helping to move the integrity and the accuracy of elections in this country forward. And in 2004, I became a nationally certified election administrator through Auburn University and the Election Center. Combine that with a degree from Long Beach State. Anyone? Okay, none. Yeah, I've got one, okay. And Troy State University, master's degree. The combination of the actual experience and my education has prepared me well to be your next Secretary of State.
Well, first of all, I have private sector experience, and let me tell you why I think that matters. I think a person who actually manages state agencies has to know what it's like out there to manage in the private sector environment, especially people who are actually paying the taxes that you're using. I think that kind of empathy is very, very important. Second, I wrote most of the election law following the 2004 election, a very, very controversial election, the closest governor's election we've had in the state of Washington. I wrote the law. Again, League of Women Voters can tell you very clearly about that. I understand the legislative process too. I've been down there 16 years, and I'm a fairly successful legislator. I've passed WGU Washington, the new virtual university. That was my piece of legislation. I created the state's Economic Development Commission. I've created the innovation partnership zones around economic development. And this last legislative session, we probably passed the most bipartisan budget in our state's history with 44 votes in the Senate. And if any of you know that, I was really right at the center of that particular debate. I also have experience when it comes to the Washington State Quality Awards. And finally, I think what's very important, I have a track record of being firmly independent. I think that's what you need in this position. I think that actually was brought out in the very first speech, that this person needs to be fiercely independent, looking at the best policy, not the best political party, has got to be the way that they are, and I'm that way. Thank you.
As the chief elections officer, the job for that is to set the course for our elections, set the template for the culture, model the culture that we need to have in Washington State. It's not to count the votes. It's not to certify the machines. The chief elections officer makes sure that is getting done, but is not the person who is guiding those specific policies. The Secretary of State should have a much more populist approach to how we are going to reach out and get more people involved in elections. It's the job to make sure that elections are competitive, because unless an election is competitive, it's meaningless. It's not worth the vote. You cannot vote if there's no choice in the voting. So I think that it's the temperament that I offer to this office, not necessarily the administrative history.
Excellent. We're now going to go into some questions from the audience, since we are running short on time, so we'll move forward a little bit. This first question, Kim, we'll start with you. Same format, of course, as we've been using all evening. My mail ballot goes through 18 pairs of hands before it is counted. How do I know it was not altered or rehabilitated?
That's an interesting term. Well, remember that there are multiple layers of security in every elections office across the state. They are for the computer system, first of all, so those of you who have concerns about the way that your ballots are counted electronically, we have a number of everything is dual controlled, so no one person is ever handling your ballot or working on the computer by themselves. And we have a log that is constantly running and capturing each keystroke, so if you ever want to go back and see what happened, you could recreate it. But also remember, we have physical layers of security as well. So we, as I mentioned, dual controls. There's never a point where your ballot is in a single person's hand or control. We have security features such as 24/7 cameras that are watching, and more importantly, we have policies and procedures that make sure that people are following the administrative code and the laws of our state to make sure that your ballot is counted accurately and hasn't been tampered with. It's varied. I would encourage each of you to go to a county auditor's office and see it firsthand. For example, many people don't believe we check every signature of every ballot envelope we have returned. We do. The Secretary of State is the one who sets the administrative code, interpreting the laws for the counties to administer, and it is important that we always keep all of those pieces in front of us.
Well, that's why it's very important that the Secretary of State be at arm's length with the local auditors. They audit the local auditors. It's very important that Secretary of State have that relationship with the auditors. In fact, in 2005, we insisted that the Secretary of State audit the local auditors. We went in and we looked at all of the different procedures that were taking place. And I think you have to be always aware of the potential of compromising ballots. We went ahead and put in procedures on the legislative level that taught how to, in fact, duplicate a ballot. People were writing directly on the ballot. People were taking provisional ballots and feeding them directly into the machine. These types of mistakes were commonly taking place in our election system, and it took an outside entity to come in and, in fact, clarify, correct all of that in our system. I think one thing we have to keep in Washington State, we have to make sure that the postmark is the identifying factor of whether that ballot is valid or not. In other states where they've just relied on it coming in at that time and the word of a local auditor, they have found thousands of extra ballots in many cases where they have not been counted. It's important that you have these verifications. So my answer is this. Sometimes those steps are important to have multiple eyes looking on the system to make sure it is a secure system. I think that's one point that we have to preserve. Thank you.
The question is hard to answer because the ballots fundamentally are anonymous. The return envelope that gets returned to the auditor's office has a little barcode that says who submitted the ballot, but the ballot itself does not have any markings on it that indicates which voter it is connected to. So to confirm that your ballot was counted as is submitted would be difficult, but you can confirm that your ballot was counted and you can confirm that your envelope was opened. So that question of whether or not you can see if a ballot was edited in any way is difficult to answer. But I believe that the state really does have great, and the auditors have great security, and for the most part, our election system is very sound.
The legislature and the Secretary of State's office has reduced the number of audits that the Secretary of State performs, they're called reviews, on the county auditors because of budgetary reasons. One of the things I want to do as Secretary of State is at least have a 3-year cycle, so every county is reviewed once every 3 years just to make sure that they are complying with state law and administrative code and being consistent county to county so that you know that your ballot is counted the same way as the person in Asotin, the person in King, the person in Spokane County.
Jim, we're going to start this next question with you. It states, I have many people who no longer live in my precinct, but still get ballots. How are you going to clean up the voter rolls?
Well, again, one thing that we passed in the 2005, 2006 that we continually have to update are lists that we can go ahead and verify whether a person is actually in a particular area or not. Clearly, if it's mailed to the person and there's no forwarding address whatsoever, which they won't forward them, they're going to come back. We've got to make sure that in a timely manner that does happen. We extended the length of time between the actual election day and the certification date to give the local auditors enough time to go through and make these kind of verifications, and they would also move the primary forward so we would have, again, more time when the ballots actually go out. One of the things that I will do, and this is a very good point, this is the kind of performance measure that we need to track in our state. Prior to those reforms, we put many ballots out there, and the local auditors could not tell you when those ballots came back what actually happened to those ballots. We made sure that every single one was accounted for, and it looks as if this is also an area we're going to have to spend time doing, and I will do that. Thank you.
Again, opening up the dialogue between the auditor's offices and the Secretary of State's offices and the voters. I believe that not just one tract of sending out signature cards to maybe be re-signed and sent back in, but maybe a phone call from one of the offices and making sure that if a signature card doesn't come back in, let's see who is living there. It doesn't have to be one fixed type of avenue to connect with voters. We need to have voters feel like they have a dialogue and to make sure that their registration is accurate.
Vote by mail, one of the benefits of it has been the cleaning up of our rolls. In 1993, when we did our first countywide vote by mail election in my county, about 15% of the ballots came back as undeliverable. And that would be people that have moved and their address had gotten stale and was outdated. Now, when we conduct an election, it's about 3%. And what that is it's a result of mailing to our voters. Every time we mail to our voters, we have that opportunity to update their address and get the most current address. So we're not seeing massive amounts of people in precincts who are getting ballots and that don't live there any longer. We're actually getting the more updated current addresses. It's a challenge. 10% of our population moves every year. So we are constantly keeping up with it, but we've actually seen it improve. And the accountability at the county level has also improved. Senator Castema is right. In 2004, counties were just struggling to keep up, and so close enough for many counties was good enough. Now, what we have at the end of every election is we turn in an actual balance sheet that shows every single ballot we received, the total number, and the disposition of each one. Was it counted? If it wasn't counted, why wasn't it counted? And we account for everything, and that's a huge step in the right direction since 2004.
One of the benefits we had, 30 seconds, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. One of the benefits we had by going to a unified database was, in fact, if someone did move from one county to the next and they did register, they would pop up at both different places. The Pew Charitable Trust, their program that they put in place, Kim apparently has worked on that program. When we do a regional effort, it will allow us not only to look at those people who move within Washington State, but of those who move outside. And usually people tend to move regionally on the West Coast, for example. Again, more connectivity, more data is important. Thank you.
And this will be our last question of the evening before we move into closing remarks. David, we'll start with you. Can you give any specific examples of how you have empowered voters in the past?
I was the campaign manager for the top 2 primary. That gave every voter in the state of Washington the right to choose what person they want to elect to represent them and serve for them, opposed to having to choose one party and be stuck within that one party's domain to vote. This debate here tonight, if we had a Montana primary, the type of primary that was proposed by some people up here tonight, if we had a Montana primary that was still a partisan, closed primary, this debate would have not happened. We would have had a segregated political society, and there would be limited debate in our state. Opening up the debate, opening up our elections empowers all voters. California has followed it. Alaska's looking at it. Arizona's looking at it. Top 2 primaries has empowered every voter in the state of Washington. The Electoral College, I've given a voice to protecting the Electoral College. That was a wholesale loss of an enormous amount of power for the state of Washington. We gave our state's power in presidential elections to South Carolina, Florida, Ohio, and Nebraska. We have lost an enormous amount of power, and I've worked to protect that power. And I've been a voice for reasonable, nonpartisan redistricting. The political parties are trying to control our voters in the state of Washington, and the voters need to take it back. And I have been fighting that fight for the last 10 years, and I will continue to fight that fight. Thank you.
When the Montana or pick a party primary and the top 2 primary were proposed as legislation, I had the opportunity to testify on behalf of my citizens who were very clear in not wanting a pick a party primary, and that is how I testified on that bill, just for the record. Some of the things we've done in Thurston County, we've created a voter accessibility advisory committee where we had people across the spectrum, predominantly people with special needs representing the blind community, the deaf and hard of hearing communities, and gave us ideas of things that we could do to reach out to their communities and get information, such as doing translation in American Sign Language on our video voters guide so that people who are deaf or hard of hearing could have access to it. We instituted the primary local voters pamphlet in addition to our regular general election pamphlet to get more access to information to all of our voters. And then, of course, I've talked about the email ballot program. So, as I said before, my experience in Germany really set the tone and made not only access to voting and registration, but access to information so that people can be informed when they cast their ballot, when they sit at their kitchen table voting, they're making an informed decision and taking into account all of the information. And that's what I've done to help empower voters.
I will continue supporting the top 2 in Washington State. David is absolutely right. It's empowering that you can have people of really diverse philosophies, political ideologies up here debating, and those that are not just partisan, and again, especially for this particular race. But after the 2004 election, people in Washington State felt very disenfranchised. In the legislature, the House didn't want to do anything when it came to election reforms. They wanted to wait. I was the force in the legislature, and if you review back on TBW, I was the force who said we have to do something in the legislature, and most of the reforms came out of the Senate. My hope is the reforms we put in place, and what you've heard today, the benefits from that from the current auditors, is because we put in place things that, again, hopefully restore your faith. But let me look even big picture wise of what I've done in the legislature. I have tried to empower voters by actually electing someone in Olympia who acts in a nonpartisan way and will reach across the aisle when it makes sense. And those of you who know me, again, I am a fiercely independent legislator, and that led to monumental reforms this year in the legislature. Pension reform. It led to a 4-year balanced budget bill that no other state in the nation has. We rescinded the out-of-state bank tax credit, which, by the way, needed Republican and Democratic votes, and we had an 18,000 job package that passed. Why? Because someone was willing to walk across the aisle and deal in a bipartisan manner. I hope my actions speak louder than words and empower the voters, make them feel like their vote really matters. Thank you.
I beg to differ, Senator. In 2004, you were one of the 4 senators who signed a letter to Gary Locke to take the top 2 primary system out of a bill and keep the Montana system in that bill. It was your actions that created the Montana system that we had for 1 year. The reason that the 2004 election was so divisive is because the primary that people voted in earlier, everybody had to identify themselves with one political party. And so the partisan passions that were instilled in the primary carried on into the general election. In the general election, we weren't just Washingtonians voting in that election. We were not Washingtonians. We were Republicans and Democrats fighting it out again. So I just think that—
Your time is up.
Thank you.
In front of you, you've got some yes or no cards. No is red, yes is green. I'm going to go through and quickly ask you a few of these. The following policies were proposed in the 2012 legislative session. Please indicate your views on each one by showing a yes card if you would support the legislation, or a no card if you would oppose it. Automatically register to vote anyone who obtained a driver's license unless they opted out. Allow new registrations to vote up to and on Election Day. Allow 16 and 17-year-olds to register to vote.
Pre-register, please.
No, the question is allow 16 and 17-year-olds to register to vote.
See. Yes.
Require proof of citizenship for voter registration.
See. Yeah.
Require proof of citizenship for voter registration. For voter registration. Require proof of citizenship for voter registration. A Voting Rights Act that would allow lawsuits over district lines and other election processes that are allegedly unfair to minority voters.
Could you read that again?
A Voting Rights Act that would allow lawsuits over district lines and other election processes that are allegedly unfair to minority voters. Again, want to thank everyone for being here. You've each got 3 minutes for closing remarks. David, we'll start with you and work our way down the table.
Great. Thank you, Blake. This was really fun. It was. I hope we all learned something. I certainly enjoyed sharing with these candidates about what's on their minds, about what's important. The top two is the most important issue that came before the last Secretary of State. Sam Reed fought valiantly to protect your rights as voters to have as much freedom and as much power when you go to exercise your vote. We need to have a Secretary of State who's going to fight tooth and nail to protect that. But there's more issues that are going to be facing the next Secretary of State. The next Secretary of State is going to have to really be engaged with the information age. Right now, we are about to take on a tidal wave of information that's going to change the very dynamic of what it is to be a citizen. We are becoming digital citizens. I hope the next debate we can really address some of the things that how radical that is going to change what it is going to be a citizen in our society. But fundamentally, what I hope to bring to the state in our elections in the state of Washington is competitive elections. Elections are meaningless unless there's competition provided. And I hope to serve you as the next People's Secretary of State. Thank you.
Only because I heard audible gasps to my no on the citizenship. Just a clarifying point. It's such a narrow question. It's something that we need to have further discussion on because, for example, there isn't this list of citizens. There isn't an easy way for many people to prove they're citizens. There was an article about a U.S. service member about a month ago in the paper who served in the Army for 20 years and went to get a passport, and he couldn't prove his citizenship and almost was denied and wasn't able to go back to Afghanistan and work. So it's a complex issue, and I'm just saying that there's more that we need to do. It's not just a simple yes or no. I want to make sure that you have the confidence that your ballot is counted accurately, that it is protected, it's secure, and that it's not canceled out by an ineligible voter. I'm going to bring my experience and expertise to that, and quite frankly, it's a job that you can't do on the job training. The next Secretary of State needs to be able to hit the ground running and be able to take on these tough issues. The second area is I want to make it easier for you to do business in Washington State. As the Chief Corporations Officer, the Secretary of State is uniquely poised to do just that. Corporations have to file annually with the Secretary of State's office. Why aren't we connecting them to the Department of Licensing and the Department of Revenue and the cities and counties and all of the places in this state that they have to do business with government, and make it easy and streamlined, and then they can get on with doing business and actually get people to work because they're creating jobs. And finally, one of the things that I did not enjoy when I was in high school was history and math. Two of the things I didn't enjoy. And ironically, I've spent my career in jobs that are based in history and math. And history in the last 20 years for me has come alive, partly because of the auditor's office, because you actually can look, and the dates and the times aren't just dates and times on a piece of paper. They're people, and the stories are what make it come alive. And that's what we need in the Secretary of State's office. As a state's historian, when our kids go to the Capitol, or you take your children or grandchildren, they should be able to connect with history in the way that I'm talking about, where it comes alive. How many of you can tell me where the State Archives is? Okay, that's about 10% of the room. Most people can't, and that's a shame, because that's our state's history. And when, like I said, you go to the Capitol or your kids go to the Capitol, they should have that connection. We need to empower the Heritage Center project, which we have been setting money aside for, and the legislature has swept twice. And we need to get that back on track so the state library and the state archives are connected to the Capitol visits, and that we make that history come alive and we pass it on to the next generation. That's what I want to do as your Secretary of State, and I thank you for all of your listening tonight.
I think government needs a fundamental shift in its philosophy. The leaders in our state need to change the way they perceive the public. I think right now they perceive the public as generally irrational. They have to be cajoled. They have to be tricked into doing the right thing. I saw that in December when a tax proposal went forward and asked the voters to vote for more sales tax. And what was included on there? K-12 spending, higher education, supervision of sex offenders, and senior citizen services. They weren't there because they were low priority items that would be cut. They were put there because they could get your vote. I think you need to start treating people as if they are rational. If I show you a good performance, if I show you a good product, you will respond by supporting that service or that in a tax or whatever the case may be. The Secretary of State has to be an icon for that kind of management in Washington State. Remember, I talked about the different performance measures when it comes to how many people register, how many people actually vote. Again, what I will bring to my office is when you enter that office, there'll be balanced scorecards, which, by the way, are just 5 different areas with 2 or 3 key performance measures in each. You'll be able to see how my office is doing, whether I'm hitting my targets on many of the items that have been discussed today, and then how we rank compared to the top 3 states. I will show you the good, and I will show you the bad, and I will show you how we are getting to improve those particular performance measures. My hope is the office will be more than just elections and building your trust in that regards, but you will soon learn to trust government by seeing someone do it right. Now keep in mind this, the 2004 election, what it did demonstrate was that you do need an arm's length between the Secretary of State's office and the local auditors. Secretary of State needs to audit, and those need to be rigorous audits, or else, frankly, you will have the complacency that occurred in the past. What happened in 2004 didn't happen overnight. It took years to get there. I will be rigorous, I will be nonpartisan, and I will scrutinize the election system so that I'll earn your trust. And that's what I'll base my reelection on. Thank you very much.